Maria Prymachenko is one of the most famous Ukrainian artists of the 20th century. For many Ukrainians, her works are a symbol of Ukrainian folk art with its inexhaustible imagination, love of bright, vivid colors, and instructive stories that draw inspiration from traditional folklore. Prymachenko was born in 1909 in a small Ukrainian village of Bolotnya, 90 kilometers from Kiev. This relative proximity of the artist's native village to the capital is deceptive. At the beginning of the 20th century, the long Middle Ages still reigned in the wooded areas around Bolotnya, and there were only 17 households and 104 inhabitants in the village's south. Maria Prymachenko was immersed in the traditions of Ukrainian peasant art from a young age. This early exposure laid the foundation for her future endeavors. Prymachenko is the flesh and blood of Ukrainian rural culture. If we assume that talent is hereditary, then Maria is a very appropriate example. Her father was a virtuoso carpenter. He made fences with stylized carved outlines. Prymachenko's mother was a recognized master embroiderer, known far beyond her village. There is also some information about the artist's grandmother, who used to decorate Easter eggs. As a child, Maria Prymachenko fell ill with poliomyelitis and became disabled for the rest of her life. Having learned to embroider from her mother, from the beginning of the 1920s to early 1930s, she worked at the Embroidery Art Cooperative Union in the nearby town of Ivankiv. She embroidered traditional ornaments and also created her own artistic compositions. Prymachenko's creative path as an independent artist started in 1935 in Kiev at the School of Masters of Folk Art, the only educational and creative institution in Ukraine in the mid-1930s. The school was reorganized into the Central Experimental Workshops, located on the premises of the Kiev Pchersk Lavra and organized to prepare for the first Republican exhibition of folk art that was shown in 1936 in Kiev, Moscow, and Leningrad. Prymachenko received great support from the best folk masters of Ukraine: Ivan Honchard, the Gerasimenki brothers, Paraska Vlasenko, Tetiana Pata. Friendly atmosphere in the workshops was also supported by the managers, Rudikov, director of the museum, and also Hagenmeister, head of the school and experimental workshops in 1936 and 1937. Maria also learned from the best Ukrainian professional artists. Famous modernists Vasyl Krychevsky and Anatol Petritsky, as well as future superstars of Ukrainian socialist realism Vasyl Kasyan and Mikhailo Deregus, all taught at the experimental workshops. Between 1936 and 1937, Maria Prymachenko created albums of brilliant artwork, which were filled with fantastic characters, each of them evoking the spirit of surrealism. Almost immediately, she began to receive all kinds of official bonuses for her work. Here it is worth remembering the bloody atmosphere of 1937, where the Boychukists were crushed by the Stalinist regime for daring to offer their own interpretation of folk art. In this comparison, the Soviet art establishment's paradoxical attitude, or rather its intentional doublethink, becomes glaringly obvious. Folk art became an ideological tool under Stalinism. Having understood the need to demonstrate the prosperity and increased creativity of the masses, Soviet authorities closed their eyes to the fundamental divergence between the folk art aesthetic and the language of socialist realism. Decorative and applied art inhabited a sheltered niche, and it was thanks to this niche that the art of Maria Prymachenko and others like her survived and garnered acclaim. At the same time, this meant that it had a marginal status, and for many years it was labeled as naive. Many know Prymachenko as a unique, naturally gifted self-taught artist, a barely literal granny in a headscarf, creating masterpieces in a distant village backwater. The mythology surrounding Maria Prymachenko was in part created by the artist herself, who spent several decades carefully cultivating this image after she returned to her home village. During the Soviet period, a peasant headscarf and a demonstrably rural way of life was an effective defense against many ideological storms. Maria Prymachenko and her unique cosmology did not appear out of thin air. They both grew out of the powerful folk avant-garde school of which Exter and Przybylska were the driving force. Of course, it is also difficult to call a person self-taught when she works shoulder to shoulder for 2 years with such distinguished artists as Krychevsky and Petritsky, and later collaborated with a film studio in Kiev. Prymachenko's best work was created following her acquaintance with illustrious modernist and folk artists. Having returned to her home village before the war, the artist established her own brand of distinctive art, which persisted right up until her death. She created a whole artistic world which would have a significant influence not only on Ukrainian fine art but also on design, fashion, and mass culture. Her style evolved into a vivid tapestry of colors, blending realism with fantasy and often depicting scenes of nature, village life, and folklore. This fusion of elements made her work not just visually stunning, but also culturally significant, providing a window into the soul of Ukrainian rural life. Prymachenko's artistry was not created in isolation, but was a reflection of the times she lived in. During World War II, her civil husband and father of her only son went to war and was killed on the front. Maria returned to her native village pregnant and stopped creating art for a while. She would stay in Bolotnya for all her life and would return to art only in the mid-1940s after the end of the war. From the end of the 1950s, she engaged in public work and organized a children's club in her native village. She showed her work at the exhibitions organized by the Union of Artists and became its member in 1960. Since then, the format of Maria Prymachenko's drawings has become larger. Instead of the white background of her early works, colored backgrounds have appeared in her works since the mid-1960s. The imagery also changed. From the somewhat transparent watercolor of her early works with graphically clear contours, the artist moved to thick saturated gouache. The artist hated war with all her heart for the rest of her life. There is no direct depiction of the harsh realities of war and its impact on her homeland in her works, but after all, she was not a realist painter. The war appears in her works indirectly, through the sad eyes of her favorite magical creatures, as well as through the titles of works in which the artist warns future generations against the horrors of war. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, at the height of the Cold War, when the world was on the verge of a new catastrophe, the fear of nuclear war could be heard in many of her works. Text played a big role in Prymachenko's late work. In the 1970s, she started coming up with witty rhythmic captions for almost every work, which in their structure resembled folk songs, sayings, and even sometimes magical spells. The fact that Maria Prymachenko was not alien to magical thinking is apparent from the fact that after the war, she often said that by drawing strange creatures in the experimental workshops in Kiev in the late 1930s, she thereby caused the war and its horrors. And yet, Maria Prymachenko did not stop drawing animals and fantastic creatures until the end of her life. At first, these creatures look so unusual that it is hard to find parallels of this kind of visuals in Ukrainian folk art. But in fact, there was a rich tradition in Ukraine of painting magical creatures as well as flowers on the exterior and interior walls of rural huts, and especially on the walls of traditional stoves. Maria Prymachenko, with the help of her mentors at the experimental workshops in Kiev, started painting her creatures on paper instead of the walls, thus elevating this traditional art form to an absolutely new heights. In 1986, a catastrophic explosion happened at the Chernobyl nuclear power station. Chernobyl was only 50 kilometers away from Bolotny. For Prymachenko, it was a shock and a huge stress. Many villages nearby were evacuated, and the echo of the disaster was felt in the region as well as in all of Ukraine for years. Prymachenko reflected a lot on the catastrophe in her art. And if visually these pieces sometimes don't differ from her other works, the texts that accompany the artworks are very expressive. Here's an example of one of them. She says, "This is how the forest block was pictured in a dream. Flowers will grow in it and children will carry flowers, as a monument will be forever around him. Doves will fly to eat our heroes. They saved us and they left us." In this 1988 artwork, the artist created a kind of monument to tens of thousands Chernobyl nuclear disaster liquidators who died in 1986 or passed away later. During her 89 years of life, the artist created more than 650 artworks. In her paintings, she depicted charming, non-existent animals, flowers, and scenes from peasant life. Maria Prymachenko's son, Fedor Prymachenko, also became a renowned folk artist. Internationally recognized, Prymachenko's art has been exhibited worldwide, bringing Ukrainian art to a global audience. Her influence extends beyond the art community, impacting contemporary Ukrainian culture and national identity. Her legacy is not only in the artworks she left behind, but also in the inspiration she continues to provide to artists and cultural enthusiasts. Due to the Russian aggression in Ukraine in 2022, thousands of objects of cultural infrastructure and cultural heritage were destroyed or damaged. In the spring of 2022, during the offensive of Russian troops in the village of Ivankiv in the Kiev region, the Ivankiv Historical and Local History Museum, where the artworks of Maria Prymachenko were kept, burned down. However, about 10 paintings got saved thanks to the care of local residents and museum staff. Unfortunately, the embroidered exhibits burned down. However, many towels have survived in the collections of local artisans. On May 5, 2022, the surviving painting from the museum by Maria Prymachenko, which was titled Flowers Grew Near the Force Power Unit, was sold for $500,000. All proceeds from the auction went to help the armed forces of Ukraine.